I'm James Brooks, president of SAR, and really pleased to have you all here. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Professor Corinne Kratz, who's the member of the Department of Anthropology and the Institute of African Studies at Emory University. Corinne held an NEH resident scholar appointment with us in 2004 and 5, was joined with her much beloved and very much missed husband, Ivan Karp, whom she and we lost in 2011. Corinne is still a member of the SAR community, though. She serves annually for us as one of the faculty mentors for our Campbell Fellow. This is a new program now 3 years old that brings a scholar from the third world, the developing world, to SAR to work specifically on issues of women's economic and social empowerment. And in addition to providing residential space and office space in a community, we also provide mentorship for those fellows, and Corinne is one of those, so we thank you for that. It's been great. So let's welcome Corinne and hear about the Wodaabe.
Thank you, James, and good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm, delighted to be part of the lecture series last year. I was here for a number of the lectures, and I do have to say it's a little bit daunting to follow some of the wonderful lectures that we've had this year. They're hard acts to follow. But what I want to do this evening is make an argument and tell a story. And I'm using both words and images to do that. I have a lot of images that I'm going to show you, and they come in clusters over the course of the talk. It's far more than any advice on PowerPoint would tell you should be using. But in order to get through those, and also because the images and the words are very tightly integrated as I'm trying to tell this story, I'm going to stick pretty closely to my written text, but I hope you're going to find this an engaging story. But the first thing I want to ask is, are these images familiar? Have people? Yes, okay. I would be surprised. I actually talked about this in South Africa once, and some people had not seen them. So, the Wodaabe people of the Sahel have been the subject of over 17 documentary films, including 3 that were released the same year, twice, 1988 and in 2007. Filmmakers from Robert Gardner and Werner Herzog to National Geographic to individual researchers turned their lenses on Wodaabe life, and particularly on their visually spectacular geerewol and yake dances. Likewise, Wodaabe have figured in sumptuous coffee table books. They've been on the cover of National Geographic, Elle magazine, World Bank brochure, advertising, CD, album covers. Their images have inspired painters. They've been transferred onto merchandise such as canvas bags, mugs, and mouse pads. This concentration on Wodaabe, when you start to look at it, it seems like it's a visual obsession. But it's really striking given the great diversity of culture and performance that there is on the African continent. The Wodaabe are a pastoral Fulani people of, the estimates range between 100,000 and 200,000 people, sometimes known as the Bororo. Most live in Niger, where they are denigrated and have often been marginalized by their nomadic life and by their non-Islamic religion. Wodaabe are particularly known for the performances in these images, the geerewol and yake dances, which occur during annual gatherings. Both involve competitions between young men from 2 lineages and moieties and selection of the most beautiful dancers. Since 1950, the dances have been performed as entertainment and cultural spectacle for varied audiences. Tonight, I'm going to consider some questions related to these recurring images. But this is only partly about the Wodaabe. It's more about the circulation and the proliferation and the reframing of cultural images and about cultural obsession. But the obsessions are ours, even though they're presented as theirs. What I'm going to do is sketch the process of proliferation and the story of how this global Wodaabe cornucopia came about. Wodaabe films, books, and images have circulated in Europe, in the US, and in African countries. One Japanese example is on Ornette Coleman's Virgin Beauty CD. Wodaabe themselves have performed internationally in France, Denmark, Belgium, Spain, Canada, the Netherlands, Morocco, Burkina Faso, and other African and European countries. They've been the warm-up for Baaba Maal in Paris, and they've also performed at Euro Disney. In Niger, they perform for dignitaries, heads of state, and tourists, at agricultural shows, and there's an annual post-Ramadan celebration that's held in the Niamey Sports Stadium. Tourists, journalists, diplomats, and expatriate aid workers attend the dances that Wodaabe organize for themselves outside of town settings. The Wodaabe Tuareg musical group, Etouan Finatawa, which is what you were listening to when, before, as you were coming in, they also incorporate dress from the dances when they perform what they call their Nomad blues. And they've toured in Europe, North and South America, Australia, West, South, and Central Africa. Some of you may have seen them when they played in Santa Fe, I think like 2 or 3 years ago. So some of you may have seen them. But in short, Wodaabe dance and images has gained widespread international currency over roughly the last 60 years. And I think it's fair to say that you can now think of it as a global phenomenon. The proliferation and spread of Wodaabe imagery and performances offers a way to understand how cultural resources, in this case, visual representations, people, and performances, how they circulate in global economies. The Wodaabe case highlights complications in those disparate circulations, and it shows how they can entwine across locales and scales. Now, African art is no stranger to the marketplace, of course, but the Wodaabe case points to transformations in how markets are defined, how the interconnections and the circulations work, and in the cultural resources, in the knowledge, the products, and the practice that are involved in creative production. These transformations, they can be local, they can be regional, they can be cross-regional, international, multinational, sometimes they're global. And they entail different kinds of conjunctions that can produce collaborations or debates or tensions, sometimes conflicts, and they've got positive and negative outcomes alike. And these shifts and processes can lead to a range of transformations. Some of them are formal. So for instance, when Wodaabe dances, which are usually danced in a circle, are then staged in lines so that they can be facing European festival audiences, and they're framed by a presenter. Or sometimes in Niger, Wodaabe will mix dance styles in some of the tourist performances. Some of the transformations entailed structural changes. As the Wodaabe performances expand to international settings, schedules coordinate with tourist itineraries, they articulate with market processes. There are a lot of examples of changes in the kind of processes involved for Wodaabe. There are shifts in the very production of the performances as lineage associations began to organize the tour performances, or there's a new annual assembly that was started in 2004. There are new brokerage relationships and new transnational networks that link performances and some development projects. There's also, of course, monetization of relations through photography fees and jewelry sales, and the commodification of some of the images. Yet, while the Wodaabe phenomenon clearly entails a very far-flung distribution of images and performances based on equally wide-reaching international interactions, most of the films, the popular photo books, and the performances are framed by a different narrative. They present a different Wodaabe, described as traditional, unchanging, authentic, often called people of the taboo. Their culture is portrayed as ancient, connected to rock paintings in the region, and their nomadic life and lack of housing underline the exotic contrast. Some of the films in the late 1980s commented on the droughts in the region at that time and on Wodaabe movement to towns and refugee camps, and they framed that as endangered culture. But this is a template that is very familiar, and it's not at all unique to the Wodaabe. Deconstructing stereotypes of timelessness, isolation, primitivism, and disappearance is usually the starting place for analyzing representations of African societies and other seemingly exotic others. But it doesn't always seem to change the images and the representations that much. The wodabe proliferation is notable then, but it's not unique. Just looking at the film collection at Emory University where I work, I found a dozen films about the Maasai and 18 about Zulu. Both of them have got long representational histories that include trade cards, stereographs, and this is a stereograph of Zulu on the top and Maasai on the bottom, staged popular presentations, films, photo books, games, advertising. But it's precisely through this dispersed but ubiquitous repetition that crosses media, crosses formats, and crosses contexts. That's how stereotypes and archetypes are reproduced and perpetuated. And, you know, in the ones I'm talking about, the pastoralists are often cast in a kind of a romanticized noble savage role. But there are a couple of things that are striking about the wodabe images in films. First, they have a really marked thematic consistency. The 18 Zulu films that Emory has, they focus on health and healing. There's religion, there's some on migrant labor, music, history, and the Maasai films have got a similar range. But while the 12 wodabe films I've seen, they offer general ethnographic portraits. With only one exception, the young men's dances are prominent visually and thematically. Dance preparations or performances are on the screen half the time in some of the films, a quarter the time in others. And in a couple of them that explicitly offer a survey of Wodaabe or Fulani life, it's 10 to 15%. But even the films with the lower screen times emphasize dance images by using them either for a very dramatic start or a kind of a climactic finale. And the way the dances figure in the verbal narration also adds to the emphasis. The second thing that's striking is that wodabe seemed to be a more recent addition to the cast of cultures in this imaginary of otherness. I found very few occurrences that could trace wodabe images back to colonial government documentation, to postcards or stereographs. Only two came up when for a while, I followed the postcard auctions for a couple of months. And two of them came up, likely from the 20s and 30s. Fulani were known and pictured on colonial postcards, as were Tuareg. But scholars that I consulted who have extensive knowledge of stereographs and colonial postcards of Africa could not recall images, early images of Wodaabe dancers like the ones that are now so widespread. In the early 20th century, it seems as if Wodaabe images were not circulating widely and marking a distinctive, visually striking identity. If we think about the images that are now so recurrent as one of many such proliferations then, the Wodaabe case provides a way that is visually focused to try to unravel how they went from visually relatively invisible, virtually non-existent, to ubiquitous. And that story, I'm hoping, will illuminate how a broader imaginary of otherness is reproduced and perpetuated. So what I want to start doing now is outlining the structure of the process that I think is involved and telling the story of how it is that Wodaabe images proliferated. Popular primitivism and exoticism are historical phenomenon with diverse visual histories. They include visual proliferations that take place at different times with varied trajectories. But while the cases differ, they're still part of the same shared history, and they draw upon related ideas and processes. By reconstructing this story, the Wodaabe episode, I'm identifying structural features of visual proliferations where cultural resources circulate in global economies. I think the process has four components. Although the fascination with Wodaabe images, I mean, it's really over-determined by cultural, political, economic, and visual factors that all coincide. But if you look over time at the process, I think I've got some components that repeat in different situations. First, there are enabling factors. In other words, there are local conditions that draw attention to certain images, certain practices. Second, there's a set of associations, affinities, resonances, logics. You can find different ways to talk about it. They pave the way for the potential of extra-local reception and popularity and create what I'm calling a receptive imaginary. So a particular cultural practice or a group seems to provide a link or a contrast or a translation of familiar practices or values that are relevant to those who become the potential audience. These are imaginative bridges between cultural difference, and they help motivate the interest for the viewers. The third component consists of particular conjunctures. So there are historical, cultural, and political economic conditions that come together and create the circumstances that are then congenial to those resonances and logics being activated on a much wider scale. And finally, there are sparks, precipitating events, objects, encounters, and they catapult the images into a wider range of settings and uses and ignite wider circulation. And, of course, I have to give the caveat that I can give you a structure that has these four aspects, but they do overlap, sometimes they blur. So let me now tell the story of how this Wodaabe Rama developed, as I've been able to piece it together. The story will have some gaps. There are some episodes that are missing. There are some actors that are missing. Some of the connections are unknown. But virtually every story of transnational circulation will have those kinds of gaps. And tracing the process, I think, can be suggestive. So among the enabling factors here are the very importance that yake and geerewol competitions have for Wodaabe themselves. This is a studio portrait that Wodaabe, when they were fully dressed, they went into the studio to have a portrait taken with their friends. This is from the 70s. There are other ways that the importance is signaled. Being a beautiful dancer, it's a topic of Wodaabe proverbs. It's the object of a lot of work. It brings fame for winners and nostalgic memories for others. Boysen calls the dances, quote, the core of communal aesthetico-ritual self-experience, which I take to mean that, it really resonates for people. Likewise, others in the region recognize the arresting spectacle of the Wodaabe dances. So that's what I'm taking as the enabling factors. The associations and affinities, the resonances that created a receptive imaginary for Wodaabe images. There are three interwoven aspects to this. The first one that I already mentioned is the extensive set of images related to a kind of popular primitivism that emphasizes isolated tribes and exotic practices. With those goes the second, which is a more specific one, and it's a long-standing romance with the figure of the pastoralist as an independent, sometimes mysterious individualist. Certain ethnic groups become exemplars of this in different regions, the Maasai, the Zulu, the Himba. But those are semi-nomadic peoples. They're agro-pastoralists, and the Zulu are also a kingdom. The nomad seems to be the purest version of this romantic figure. And indeed, the first Wodaabe film and book I've found by Henry Brandt is called Nomad du Soleil. And the nomad identification threads through all of the films and the popular books. The pastoral nomad figure provided a template that easily fit the Wodaabe images, defining expectations that helped propel them to wider circulation. Wodaabe epitomized the figure, the most nomad of nomads. Films emphasized their frequent movement, the lack of shelters. The National Geographic 2007 film describes their home as, quote, at the heart of the Sahel. And there's a Fulani autobiography that remarks that Jafun Fulani see Wodaabe as, quote, the most bush of the Bushmen. Just as Wodaabe seemed to heighten notions associated with nomads, the dance images of young men present the most exotic face of Wodaabe. Their widespread popularity simultaneously heightens and narrows the representation, narrowing the Wodaabe identity that becomes known while creating larger-than-life representations that take on a life of their own. This links to the third aspect of the receptive imaginary, which is based on the visual spectacle of the geerewol and yake dances themselves. These are striking, beautiful, and graceful scenes, and they feed notions of the exotic visually, and they're embedded in descriptions that foreground exotic customs and sexual liaisons, giving the images particular gendered spins. The spin builds on gender dislocations from a Euro-American perspective. To our eyes, Geerewol and yake seem to invert and echo our own pageants and rituals of gender. Beauty contests, voguing, cross-dressing, and flirtatious adornment and seduction. Though based on glaring cross-cultural misreadings, these are the memorable images eventually recycled in the media, in magazine advertising, commercials for McDonald's, and elsewhere. And I'll say a good bit more later on the gender side of it, but let me keep going now and get to the first conjuncture in this process. The dance's local cultural salience and the ways Wodaabe invoked Euro-American popular primitivism, nomadophilia, and gender fascinations, they set the stage for particular conjunctions and sparks to come together. There are two chapters that I see in this process, two conjunctures and sets of sparks to consider. The first one starts in the 50s with a confluence of new attention to Wodaabe in research, in documentation, and prominent performance venues. Professional anthropological research with the Wodaabe started in the 1950s, when the International African Institute commissioned research by Derek Stenning in Nigeria, Marguerite Dupire in Niger and Cameroon, and C.E. Hopen on the pastoral Fulani in Nigeria. So at the same time that the International African Institute was commissioning research, the director of the Swiss Musée d'Ethnographie de Neuchâtel sent filmmaker Henry Brandt to Niger for 6 months. Brandt produced Nomad du Soleil, the first film about Wodaabe, and then a book by the same name, which this is from. This is the first of 5 film-book pairings about Wodaabe over the years. The cluster of researchers that started working with Wodaabe in the 50s, they defined 2 strands of work, which continue to now, but they have markedly different trajectories of circulation. The first one is focused on history, social structure, cultural ecology, marriage, and politics. And you could probably guess that it's largely circulated mainly in scholarly circles. Some facets did get into development work, though, and this is how this strand took visual form. Habanai, a 1970 film strip cassette program, if you remember those, was produced by Oxfam, and it described a herd reconstitution program based on cattle lending practices. This is an interesting didactic piece, and it has images of camps, sandstorms, Wodaabe portraits, a lot of livestock shots, and drought scenes of cattle bones. Dance images are totally absent, and Wodaabe are described, quote, as known for their special love of animals, not for dances or beauty contests. Given the format, the topic, and the producer, I think Habanai probably had a relatively limited circulation. Notably, though, the book by Stenning, which is the first book, also pays little attention to geerewol and yake dances. There are only 2 paragraphs. It's a 1959 book, only 2 paragraphs about it. There was a new edition that came out in 1994 when these images were widely known, and there's a new introduction by Philip Burnham, who's puzzling over how it is that there can only be 2 paragraphs in Stenning's book. The other research strand is represented by Brandt in the 50s, and that's the one that has been heavily visualized. It also presented an ethnographic portrait of social relations, marriage, and the importance of domestic herds. Brandt's book has lovely poetic descriptions of Wodaabe life across the seasons. And as in the Habanai film tape, Brandt first notes, quote, the passion that binds them closely to their large herds of black zebu cattle. Beauty is not the immediate focus, but rainy season gatherings and young men's dance images are the book's climax, with fold-out color images in what's largely a black and white book. Brandt's film parallels the book's structure. There are dance images that appear, but only 25 minutes into the 44-minute film. Brandt's final section includes themes that have become familiar from the subsequent flood of Wodaabe films and books, but there are telling differences. After a dance scene with young men and women alike, young women feature, and the first discussion of beauty is accompanied by pictures of young women. The geerewol gathering follows with descriptions of dress and ornament that are similar to the recent ones, but young women and men alike are described as beautifying themselves. Other emphases also differ. The dance is, quote, a solemn presentation of young men, the strange beauty contest that opposes several lineages. But the contest aspect returns only later, after evocative portrayals that stress the hypnotic effect of the songs. And if you want to hear the song, I have a clip that I can play during the question period. Finally, Brandt's book does not sexualize the event like the recent depictions. He uses the word seduction only once, and that's in relation to trying to catch the judge's eye. His demure version of what happens next explains that couples come together for verbal jousting. For eloquent speaking skill is also valued. He goes on, quote, "What happens next, only the Bororo and the night know. But it's certain that one does not go much beyond long amorous discussion, and great reserve rules the attitude of each couple." These differences seem small, but given how uniform the later representations are in films and books, Brandt's more balanced gender treatment and attention to song and lack of emphasis on sexual encounters is distinctive. Jean Rouch calls Nomad du Soleil a classic, and he counts Brandt among the handful of pioneers at the time. I don't know exactly how widely it was shown. Rouch says it's never been distributed commercially, but it's certainly registered on later authors, filmmakers, and presumably other viewers. I see Brandt's film and book as the spark of this 1950s conjuncture, as important vehicles through which Wodaabe images began to circulate more widely. The film received an International Film Festival Award in 1955. It impressed viewers at the Musée de l'Homme when it was shown there in 1955. It was screened in Belgium by the Comité International du Film Ethnographique. Stenning's monograph footnotes it with admiration, and the missionary Père-Henri Bocquenet saw it at a cinema in 1962 and said it was, quote, his first visual encounter with this unknown world. Brandt's film and book are cited as inspiration or source by the next cluster of researcher filmmakers who worked with the Wodaabe in the 70s and the early 80s. And I'll get to that. That will be the second conjuncture of the story. For instance, Robert Gardner saw Brandt's film in the late 50s. In 1971, 7 years before he filmed Deep Hearts, he said, quote, "There is a short but memorable film made in the 50s called Nomad du Soleil. This film, I'm sure, helped to fixate my mind on certain qualities of appearance, environment, and emphasis, with which I then invested all herding groups." Likewise, Danish anthropologist Mette Boven mentions the film, and Brandt's book is noted in the 1983 book Nomads of Niger by photographer Carol Beckwith. Boven later made 2 films and published the book Nomads Who Cultivate Beauty, and Beckwith was involved with 3 other films. Brandt's work and images then animated the first American-made Wodaabe film decades later and informed the next set of people who figure in the proliferation of Wodaabe images. When you're tracing image circulation, chapters can be kind of like cycles. They don't always end, but the elements and the sparks of the conjuncture have a certain reach and period of prominence, even if their traces and their influence percolate into later chapters. So before turning now to the second conjuncture, let me talk about the final piece of the 1950s conjuncture of attention, which has to do with an expansion in Wodaabe performance venues. Europeans showed some interest in Wodaabe dances during the colonial period. Officials encouraged youth to form dancing troupes for tourists or visiting dignitaries. But Wodaabe danced on the national stage in 1959 at the independence celebrations. One reaction recorded then suggests that they were not known widely. The author said, quote, "All present, both blacks and whites, agreed on pronouncing that these were the most amazing people they had ever seen." These performance extensions foreshadowed the international circuits where Wodaabe now perform and brought wider notice beyond Niger. So let me turn now to the second conjuncture, which began in the 1980s. This is a second and greater confluence of attention to Wodaabe that included 8 films between 1980 and 1992, influential coffee table books, 2 new researchers who worked with visual projects. And it gets complicated because the Wodaabe images cross into other realms of circulation, including television. And the sparks in this conjuncture occur in a number of different realms. At the same time, Wodaabe began performing more regularly in Niger for opening ceremonies, for diplomatic visits, and they were on national television. And the dance troupes went to Europe, although that became more common in the 90s and 2000s. The There are three cultural and political economic shifts in the 80s that bolstered this interest and enhanced the receptive imaginary. The first were the devastating Sahelian droughts in the 70s and the mid-80s that brought a great deal of attention to the region. After Gardner's Deep Hearts and the short French film La Femme Volée, which were in the early 80s, there's a cluster of films from the late 80s, and they include this ecological theme. The resumption of geerewol gatherings becomes a sign in the environmental drama of recovery. And at the same time, wodabe were discovered in their own country when large numbers arrived in urban centers during the droughts, and when many of them incorporated seasonal urban activities into their pastoral rounds. The second change is that the politics of gender and sexuality had changed since the 50s. By the 80s, feminist and gay politics had entered mainstream social discourse and visual culture in Europe and in the US, and wodabe films and books began foregrounding gender and sexuality in interpretations of geerewol. The relative gender balance in Brandt's book, with little overt sexualization, gives way to a strong emphasis on geerewol, sexual encounters, and gender misreadings. And now I want to take a little sort of detour to look at how the films handle this theme. And then I'll come back and talk about the third shift and the sparks of this conjuncture. So this is like a little sidebar on how gender and sexuality have been handled in these films in the 80s. Starting with Robert Gardner, who spent a month in Niger in 1978 filming Deep Hearts, which was released in 1981. Geerewol is the focus of got a sparse voiceover that interprets it. He eschews sexual interpretations, and in his journal he declares, quote, "There is no room for personal or romantic notions. It's principally social in significance." La Femme Volée appeared the year before, and the sexual emphasis that became prominent is evident there, asserting that geerewol is intended to seduce women. The three films from the late 80s split on this theme. These are not wonderful pictures. This is how they are in the library at Emory. All were made for television and released in 1988. One in Granada Television's Disappearing World series. There's a National Geographic profile with Carol Beckwith, and Werner Herzog's Herdsmen of the Sun, which was made for French TV. Note that these films put wodabe on television in 3 countries, available for wider circulation. Geerewol figures in the first 2, but it dominates neither one, and neither one comments on sexual opportunities at the dance. Herzog's film, however, has a significant focus on geerewol. He describes it as a marriage market, a celebration of beauty, an occasion where sexual encounters are expected. He says, quote, "Young women have taken up their positions. Each will choose her beau for the night." He includes interview-like conversations among wodabe, and these are really one of the really delightful features of that film. And they develop it further. There's a final interview with the winner and the woman who chose him, and we're told that it takes place after they spent the night together. He asks, "Do you love me because of my beauty or my charms?" She tells him, "I've chosen you with my heart." One reviewer connected with the wodabe through these interviews. She says, "Since they seemed like us, worrying about relationships." Geerewol dress, makeup, and dance carry no sense of feminine inversion or cross-dressing for wodabe, and Herzog's verbal presentation of geerewol is entirely heterosexual. But the film's opening sequence introduces gender ambiguity for Euro-American viewers, with slow motion headshots with characteristic facial gestures. You'll see that the dancers widen their eyes and flash their teeth and turn their heads. And I'm going to give you, show you a little over a minute from the beginning of Herzog's film. soundtrack is a scratchy recording of Gounod's Ave Maria. Herzog said that he used this because it was a way to redefine the realm of truth. And the combination, so far, remember for viewers, it's relatively contextless. It certainly raises questions about beauty and purity, but perhaps also of gender and sexual identity, even for viewers who are unaware that the 1901 singer in that recording is Alessandro Moreschi, the last castrato of the Vatican. These juxtapositions are subtle, they're fleeting, but they're striking. Whatever they communicated to viewers, the film's reception highlighted sexual promiscuity and cross-dressing. That same review that I just quoted observes, quote, "Camels notwithstanding, it looks more like Paris is Burning than National Geographic," referring to the 1991 documentary about gay men competing in New York drag balls. And in fact, those two films played together in Chicago and in New York as a double feature. Some commentaries just assume the gender misreading, and analogy then just kind of collapses into assertions that geerewol are, quote, transvestite courting rituals, and that they're desert drag queens. Gender can be visually ambiguous and unstable. When we don't recognize the contextual signs that disambiguate gender identity, we tend to read it through our own familiar assumptions and familiar signs. Beauty contest signals a female competition for most of us, Euro-Americans. And dramatic headshots of dancers' faces minimize the disambiguating signs and contrasts that could give more signals. With norms of gender and sexuality still in flux, the dazzling Wodaabe geerewol captivated viewers' gendered imaginations and offered exotic titillation. The last two films of this period give geerewol a sexual framing, but they cast it as romance. These are two episodes of the Millennium television series from 1992 that had Wodaabe segments, one on the art of living, and there's one about marriage and family called Strange Relations. Geerewol is central to both of these segments, and it's presented in a kind of contrived, dramatized documentary that foregrounds a budding romance between individuals, and they're given accented English narration, written as if it's in the protagonist's voices. The geerewol footage builds this kind of romantic relation by cutting back and forth between the pair to create both a certain kind of attention and to establish that there is a narrative relation. In Strange Relations, the suitor says, "I will love you to exhaustion." And then a new wrinkle appears in The Art of Living when we see this young woman at the end of the segment sitting with her beau and her friend. And her English voice says, "I will be full woman tonight. I will love both." Let me return now to that third development, shaping the receptive imaginary, the growing interest and market for cultural diversity, indigeneity, world music, and related products in the 80s and the 90s. The politics of indigeneity gained visibility in the mid-70s and early 80s. And at the same time, the commercial potential of world music began developing rapidly in the 80s. These trends carried to other marketing spheres and stoked an appetite for images and experiences related to indigenous peoples. The Body Shop is a prime example. They sponsored the Millennium series on tribal wisdom, which was broadcast during the UN International Year for the World's Indigenous Peoples. The Body Shop used Wodaabe images in magazine advertising, on billboards, and in, as you see here, the Body Shop book. Founder Anita Roddick visited Wodaabe. She apparently searched for skin cream ingredients there. She introduced the Millennium book. She commented on Wodaabe beauty pageants and interviews. And this is just one piece of how Wodaabe films and images were caught in this wave and rode it to ubiquity. So these three shifts that I've outlined, the concern with the Sahelian droughts, the changing politics of gender and sexuality, and a greater interest in and marketing of indigeneity, they helped reorient the receptive imaginary as new sparks bolstered attention to Wodaabe materials and accelerated the circulation. Now, I mentioned that this complicated second conjuncture had several sparks and that they're in different realms of circulation. The other thing that garnered more attention were certain controversies. And the images also spread by being used in juxtaposition to comment on our own Euro-American practices, as with the Paris is Burning pairing. The films by Gardner and Herzog are two significant sparks. One of them came early in the 80s, and the other one came late in the decade. The third came in between, and it's almost concurrent with Gardner's Deep Hearts, but it was in print format, and that's Carol Beckwith's photographic book, Nomads of Niger. Now, since I've already talked a little bit about the films, let me stay with them for a second to consider the nature of their sparkiness, and then I'll come back to Beckwith. Robert Gardner's ethnographic films are some of the most widely viewed. They circulate most extensively, I think, in educational settings, but Deep Hearts also shows in film festivals, and actually Gardner is going to be honored this month by the American Film Institute in DC, so it'll probably be showing there. Deep Hearts sparked circulation of Wodaabe images in those contexts because of his prominence and pedagogical popularity for his films, but also because he's a polarizing figure for what Loisos calls his rejection of realism. Gardner seeks to portray universal themes rather than the lives and perspectives of those filmed. Some see his films as poetic compositions, others consider them to be imposed interpretations that are pretty unengaged with the people who are filmed. The camera work and the montage can seem arbitrary and choppy. The narration is sometimes a little pretentious. Contextualization can sometimes be minimal. In Deep Hearts, Gardner used Wodaabe performers to think about choice and constraint. The film has quick pans and zooms, seemingly arbitrary slow motion sections, shots that cut off people's head, and a lot of images of feet. But the debates about Gardner's work increase its visibility, and they bring his Wodaabe images wider viewing. Later in the decade, Herzog's Herdsmen of the Sun propelled filmic Wodaabe images into wide public view. The other Wodaabe TV shows in the same year were part of this, but Herzog's film was released more widely. A filmmaker of his stature garnered major reviews and commercial screenings, and Herdsmen still shows regularly in film festivals and retrospectives. Herdsmen is a continuing spark, and it has arguably kept Wodaabe film images in circulation more than any other film. Now, Carol Beckwith's 1983 book, Nomads of Niger. I see this as the third spark. Although the spark could actually better be seen as Beckwith herself as a phenomenon. This came early in the conjuncture, soon after Gardner's film. And Beckwith's photography brought Wodaabe still images into popular circulation worldwide. 3 years before this, her first book, Masai, appeared with gorgeous photos that amplified stereotypical images with lush color and sensuous detail, but also went beyond the usual, like showing the impish side of the Maasai warrior. Next, Beckwith went to the Wodaabe and photographed there for 18 months. She was later involved in film projects, first in National Geographic's Way of the Wodaabe in 1988. Beckwith was on-screen cultural guide, and she herself sported a Wodaabe coiffure in this film. 4 years later, the Millennium series lists Beckwith as an associate producer on those two Wodaabe segments. Beckwith's partner in the later books was Angela Fisher, whose 1984 Africa Adorned book includes geerewol and yake photos. So you can see here the circular formation of some of the dances. Together, they have both been a veritable joint industry of sensational African imagery with a formidable PR and marketing arm. Of the 16 books they've produced, one focuses on Wodaabe, and Wodaabe feature in 4 collections between 1999 and 2004. As this started in the early 80s, Beckwith's Wodaabe images began to travel far and wide and across domains. From that 1983 National Geographic cover story when her book first appeared, to a 1989 photo essay in the Zone Books volume Fragments for a History of the Human Body, to museums and gallery exhibitions worldwide. Apart from her energy, talent, and marketing drive, Beckwith significantly boosted visibility and circulation for Wodaabe images because she made them available in a photographic format. Single images could be readily separated from texts and context and circulate widely, be incorporated into other formats and recast. They circulated beyond her books and exhibitions in press coverage, postcards, calendars, advertising, the mass market Millennium and Body Shop books, and elsewhere, moving Wodaabe images beyond the usual orbits of circulation. Ornette Coleman's 1988 Virgin Beauty album uses one of Fisher's images, which, as I mentioned, has a Japanese version as well. And this album cover is now in the design archives of the American Institute of Graphic Arts, giving it, additional reach. Coleman's album carried the Wodaabe image into jazz arenas, but it also shows how the images are used to comment on our own histories and practice, as with the Paris is Burning pairing. This is the album's other image. A juxtaposition, perhaps ironic, that lifts Wodaabe out of the exotic to show parallels, or perhaps to expand the exotic realms to include us all. I asked scholars of French cultural history, what was this from? And they thought that the costumes were inspired by 17th century French theatricals or court fashion. And they thought that the image itself recalled a carnival or a masquerade theme ball, probably in the 30s or 40s. But whatever the provenance, the juxtaposition raises provocative questions about beauty, gender, dress, and performance. Even as the Beckwith Fisher Wodaabe images circulated prolifically, similar ones joined this expanding array. In 2000, Benetton's magazine included what they called Wodaabe warriors. Merchandise spin-offs continued: mugs, mouse pads, canvas bags. This eclectic image graced the 2002 CD of Manu Chao, which is a kind of an odd blend of Maasai beadwork and Wodaabe-ish face painting. And this advertising campaign ran in 2010, foregrounding a Wodaabe image by Beckwith, but this time women. The political economies, cross-cultural aesthetics, and timing in this second conjuncture set conditions for Wodaabe images to circulate globally, spreading, recurring, and gaining new uses and meanings. Early in the 80s, Gardner's film and the Beckwith Fisher photographs established the images in the educational realm, caught the public eye with dramatic photos and exotic-seeming practices, and provided portable versions of stunning images that could be reproduced across domains of practice. The end of the decade brought new impetus. Herzog's Herdsmen of the Sun brought artistic stature to international television presentations between 88 and 92, and has sustained a filmic Wodaabe presence ever since. Beckwith Fisher continued to produce new books with Wodaabe images. These three sparks, supported by other films, photos, and media stories, kept a steady stream of Wodaabe images in the public eye, sedimenting the wide-eyed, painted faces of young Wodaabe men into Euro-American popular culture, and sustaining a worldwide circulation of Wodaabe images that took on other lives in advertising, album covers, and more. But let's not forget the Wodaabe themselves, for they too were cultivating a presence on the world stage. Developments in Niger during this conjuncture show local and national interactions with the growing circulation of Wodaabe images, with shifts in Wodaabe dance performances, social organization, and international engagements as they and others in Niger shaped and responded to this growing interest. Time is short, so I'm just going to outline these developments and then sketch some of the latest Wodaabe films. Wodaabe learned to market themselves, in other words, their craft products, their cultural performances, and the exotic nomadic way of life, until they've now become what one researcher called a folkloristic emblem of their country. Wodaabe began selling crafts after the 1980s drought, and you can buy them online. And some remained in town, or they added urban activities to their nomadic cycle. Dance performances were an income source for young Wodaabe as they performed in more venues. Those who lived near Niamey began performing in Europe in the 1980s, but that became more common after 1990. The synergy between increasing tourism at home, performances abroad, the circulating images, and Nigerian media attention brought more performance opportunities for Wodaabe in the 90s and 2000s. This led to shifts in performance schedules and form. Geerewol is a dance that is performed annually, but tourists want performances all year. So Wodaabe staged yake for them. I already mentioned changes to adapt international performances to European expectations, like performing in lines and having a presenter explain customs. In Paris in 2003, the performance included on-stage dance preparation, and the audience was fascinated to watch young men applying makeup and painting their faces. As the performances increased, young Wodaabe men initiated a truly significant organizational change. They formed town-based pastoralist associations in order to coordinate performance tours and to take more control of their own work conditions. In 1998, the Nigerian government integrated into the tourist circuit the Cure Saleh, the so-called Festival of the Nomads, when Tuareg and Wodaabe gathered yearly. In 2004, Wodaabe stopped participating and began their own annual Assemblée Générale des Peuples Wodaabe du Niger. The assembly sought to address a situation in which Wodaabe were unsupported and unpaid, though their dances were the main tourist attraction, and where Tuareg controlled the tour group access and the fees. Etouan Finatawa is another product of the intersecting interests in world music, nomads, and tourism. Formed in 2004, it combines Wodaabe and Tuareg musicians as what's been called, quote, a gesture of reconciliation between the two sometimes feuding groups, even though it's the same year, that same year that Wodaabe started their own assembly in Niger. Both on stage and on CDs, they use dress and facial gestures from the dance. All of these phenomena has been fueled in part by decades of circulating Wodaabe images. They're some of the on-the-ground repercussions of the broad circulation. Now, as these developments extended into the 90s and 2000s and defined as a later phase of this second conjuncture, attention to Wodaabe and their images also continued. New researchers began working with Wodaabe in the mid-90s, focusing this time on urban migration, trading, music, and tourism, and bringing new insights, there's some really wonderful work, to contemporary Wodaabe circumstances. New films appeared after 2000, and photographs continued circulating. In 2002, Michael Palin's travel series Sahara became the 5th film book pairing that presented Wodaabe and geerewol, although they did not play a huge role in that, in Palin's work. Another cluster of films appeared late in the decade. In 2007, National Geographic released Tribal Secrets, the Wodaabe. 3 other films were made by researchers Chris Roy and Sandrine Lonk. Tribal Secrets, the National Geographic one, contrasts markedly with the others. It's kind of old school with a voiceover and a cutesy commentary that seems like it's almost a self-caricature at times. It's got things like built-in commercial break lines like, and this is the voice they use, it's Love Wodaabe style, as National Geographic presents Tribal Secrets, the Wodaabe. Another one says, when we return, it takes a lot of work to look this beautiful. The same year, Chris Roy produced 2 DVDs, and they're extremely well suited for teaching. He's got a series called Art and Life in Africa. He produced Fulani, The Art and Life of a Nomadic People, which covers many topics and ends with about 8 minutes on the geerewol. And he's got another, Birds of the Wilderness, which focuses on geerewol. The most recent Wodaabe film is by ethnomusicologist Sandrine Lonk. It came out in 2010, La Danse de Wodaabe, and it received it was awarded the Prix Nanook Jean Rouge. Its treatment is different. It's got fresh images and commentary. Lonk spent 10 years of research with the Wodaabe, and towards the end of that time, she started working with Uba Hassan and his wife Kedi to present Wodaabe understandings of geerewol. The film uses a pedagogical framing. Uba teaches his son about Wodaabe traditions, and that's how he's giving the explanation and the commentary. There are myth references, and it also provides a far fuller sense of the occasion beyond the dance. It's entirely in subtitled Fulfulde, and the film describes geerewol as ritual war and a lineage contest over marriage, not primarily in terms of individual romance and sexual encounter. A broader space-time framing includes scenes where older men exhort youth who they don't want to dance. So the elders are, berating them. And it also includes a number of other interlineage events. The camp scenes also differ. There are cloth shades included that convey a sense of domestic space rather than just vast desert sand. The first animals on screen are not majestic cows, but donkeys, and the last are goats. Finally, the credits are unique. They give full names for all lead singers, and they give the full names for everybody who comments on screen. Now, these are just a couple of the contrasts, but overall, Lonk's film offers an effective and compelling reframing with a much more complex and varied sense of Wodaabe perspectives and experience. Now, it remains to be seen whether it significantly alters the web of Wodaabe images and interpretations that have already sedimented into place, but it's just, I think it's still making some of the film festival circuits. If there are other films being made about the Wodaabe now, I haven't heard about them, but I would not be surprised. But that's the last one that I know of. But what I've done is I've told you something of a shaggy dog story, which is almost unavoidable when you're tracing cultural resources through global economies. So 60 years ago, the Wodaabe images were just starting to proliferate. By 2000, they were widespread and familiar. Once such a canon of images is established, then others start to play off of the canon, and sometimes there are implicit critiques in that. And I think Lonk's film might be seen in this light. Likewise, Mette Boven's pictures contrast with Beckwith's luminous ones, with umbrella shade cutting right across the dancers' faces. And when this is something that she puts on the cover of her book, it seems intentional. The images of geerewol dancers are most widely circulated in the scene, but images of young women are also starting to circulate now, most recently in ads. But I don't know whether they're even recognized as the counterpart to the male dancers. The differences among the Wodaabe films are as interesting as their proliferation, and there's a lot more to think about in this material, but that's going to have to wait. For now, I've just considered how the Wodaabe case suggests a structure of visual proliferation, and I've offered a long and winding story to trace how this one occurred. It was a story centrally about circulation and the complicated loops, jumps, eddies, and the quirky transformations that can be involved. It mapped how a convention that sometimes seems like a visual obsession becomes established in a global media space, then returns to local settings before returning back again to the global market. Many circulations were involved, from films and photographs to markets for ethnicity, to new forms of self-fashioning and self-marketing among Wodaabe themselves. The Wodaabe images are one of many visual proliferations that occur at different times, like an erupting volcano, with varied trajectories sparked from particular conjunctures. Other scholars have traced multifaceted objects like kente cloth across time and space to tell complex stories of cultural identity, political engagement, and aesthetic adaptation. Or they've analyzed how circulating images form a visual grammar that over time, through successive reproduction and repetition, defined the Bahamas and turned it into a place that was seen as tropical. These episodes are different, but at the same time, they're part of the same common history of visual encounter and representation of cultural difference. And I hope that the structure and the story of the Wodaabe case can help us understand some other parallel processes and proliferations and the histories that are involved when cultural resources circulate in global economies. Thank you.